Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to take some examples from the recently finished Spice Spring Invitational, which was held at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. There were many fighting games and some of them very instructive and interesting. So let's start with the first example that was played by the young chess phenom Daniel Naroditsky as white. He reached this position after just 20 moves against his grandmaster opponent. Let's see what's going on in the position. As we can see, both sides have castled on opposite sides, and white has an attack going with both the G and H pawns already on the 5th rank, ready to play G6 or H6 at the right moment. Another thing that is nice looking for white is the knight on D6, which is kind of paralyzes the black position. For example, it does not allow the black rook to go to C8, which would be really natural and a good thing if black could do. However, in such situations when there isn't like a forced obvious win, it's very easy to go wrong when there are options that are attractive looking, and it's very easy to misplay such positions. The young international master from California found a very good and accurate way to continue in this position. I suggest you take a little time in trying to figure out what he may have done. In other words, what should white do right now? Hopefully you spent a little time and figured out what white should do here, and there are more than one good choices, but the best of them all is clearly what Daniel did, and that was to sacrifice the exchange to get rid of black's best positioned piece. By this sacrifice also the white queen will get closer to the main target, which is black's king. Obviously black needs to recapture, otherwise white just would have won a piece. But now comes queen f4. Now the situation has completely changed, since the white queen got to the queen side and immediately, of course, is targeting the pawn on f7. Black in the game in this position chose to immediately give back the exchange and get rid of white's monster knight on d6. But the question is asking why not to simply play rook f8 and protect the f7 pawn, and by the way, this is the only way to protect this attacked pawn on f7. Well, now white would continue the attack by playing h6. It's absolutely urgent to try to open the position against the black king or weaken squares around it. Now if black would like to keep the position closed on the king's side by pushing the pawn through with g6, that would allow the white queen immediately to get to f6, and as we can see, black is pretty helpless against the checkmate threat on g7. On the other hand, if black right now does not play g6, but for example captures on h6, then the opening of the g file is pretty deadly, with the white queen about to check on g3 or g4, and the black king will be in major trouble. So going back to this position after h6, let's see what happens if black kind of does nothing, like for example moves the bishops to free up the rook to move from b6 on the next move. Well, in that case white would simply do the trade himself. When king captures back, give a check and simply grab a pawn on d7, which is not just important because it's a pawn, but also because the white rook got to the 7th rank and white's attack is pretty obvious. I think there are various threats here, either to move the knight to h6 or back to d6, or in some cases to play g6 to open up the queen's diagonal to then go to h6. And on top of all of this, white does not even have a material disadvantage. Right now black has an extra rook for a knight and 2 pawns, which even by the material count is about balanced. But white has a tremendous attack and black is in serious trouble. So let's go back a couple moves and see if let's see the position that was reached in the game. So we said rook f8, h6, and let's see if black is a bit more proactive and plays rook c6, threatening checkmate himself. Well, white simply needs to make a defensive move by, for example, advancing the c pawn to c3. Of course, now black needs to deal with the bishop hanging on b7, and if that bishop, for example, moves again away from the attack to a8, then knight f5, attacking the g7 pawn a second time. But now, because the black rook stepped to c6, there is a fork idea in the works as well, although at the moment the black queen is still guarding the e7 square, but that may change real soon. For example, after g6, white will be ready to play rook d5, and now the black queen no longer can find a good way to hang on to the e7 square, and lack of that, the white knight will go to e7, check, fork, and grab the rook. So let's go back and see what happened in the actual game after black sacrificed the exchange to liberate his position a little. So came rook takes knight, and now how would you capture back? Well, white could capture with the queen certainly, but that would allow black to check with queen e3. And white has a clearly strong attack going for him, so even the trade of queens is probably not the most efficient way to continue. So white continued correctly by recapturing with the rook, preventing black's counterplay, and, importantly, keeping the queens on the board. It's absolutely obvious that the black king is in a much bigger danger than its counterpart on the queen side. Black played immediately rook c8, trying to checkmate again on c2, with the hope that if now white would play bishop d3, then black would cause commotion with queen g1 check. But white can do better, either by advancing the c pawn to c3, or, as Daniel played, retreating the rook to d2, which is just fine, protecting the c2 pawn. After this, the white bishop will be free to develop, even to d3, because after a queen g1 check, the rook will be able to block on d1, unlike if white would have played bishop d3 immediately, then the rook wouldn't be able to come back to block a potential check. So after rook d2, black responded by playing d5, trying to activate his bishop as well. Here white continued by pushing through, which is certainly a safe move, a good move, although our silicon friends recommend g6 being even better, more forceful and energetic, threatening immediately the f7 pawn. And now, for example, if black grabs this pawn, then the white bishop will appear on h3 very nicely, threatening to go to e6 check, and then swinging the rook over to h2, checkmating the black king. So therefore the best looking try is to go to e8, preventing the white bishop to getting to e6, and then the bishop would go to d7. And now black is in trouble because the rook is unable at the same time guard the e6 square and the b8 square, the 8th rank. So for example, after rook e7, which holds off the bishop e6 threat, the problem is that the white queen will appear on b8 and simply grab the extra piece on b7. So black is in major trouble. So in this position g6 was a bit more accurate, but e5 of course is good enough to win the game as well, even though it may take a bit longer. Black played queen g1, trying to get some counterplay, counter-attacking the white bishop, and came rook d1, protecting it. Queen f2, black again is keeping white busy with a checkmate threat, but finally the bishop got out, and that is on move 27. Quite amazing that that bishop didn't have a need to develop earlier, only at this late stage in the game, which is of course an exception from the rule. Generally it's not a good idea not to develop your bishop until this late in the game. But now the bishop not only protects the c2 square, the c2 pawn, but also of course becomes an important attacker against the black king. Black responded with d4, trying to open the diagonal of the bishop from b7, and with that at the same time attack white's pawn on f3. Sadly for black, white's attack comes much quicker than black's, and here again the game continued with g6, which is certainly not a bad choice, but even more accurate was to play queen f5 to threaten on h7 right away, and then for example if g6, the most natural response, trade, and queen d7. Now black's problem is that the bishop is busy guarding the rook, so therefore it cannot move away and capture the pawn on f3. Black can try queen takes pawn on f3, protecting the bishop on b7, but now again white continues with energetic play by playing e6, trying to open up the 7th rank so the attack can continue. Pawn takes, and now rook f1, a nice move, chasing the black queen away from the f-file. Remember, the black queen also is busy guarding the bishop on b7. But hey, what happens if queen takes bishop now? Well, not only that black captured the bishop, but now the white rook is hanging, and of course there is a checkmate threat on c2. What should white do right now? Well, in this position, white certainly should not be on the defensive, should not play a move like rook f2, but should follow up on the attack. And the best way to do so is to capture the pawn with a check. And after king h8, despite the fact that the black bishop is guarding the corner h1 square, white should play rook h1. After king g7, the game would end with a quick checkmate after queen f6, followed by rook h8. Or, if black captures the rook indeed, instead of the king g7 move, black captures on h1, then queen captures the rook on c8 with a check, very importantly, and that unpins the c-pawn, which means that now white can easily and safely just capture black's queen. Again, let's go back and see how the game concluded. After d4, white played g6, which is a bit inferior but still good enough to win the game. Pawn takes, and here black played bishop f3, which speeds up the end, although the position was hopeless anyway. Came queen f5, attacking the rook, rook b8, rook f1, which is kind of a skewer, queen e3 check, king b1, and black resigned. The position is totally lost for black. The bishop is about to fall, or if the bishop would try to move away, for example to d5, then pawn takes pawn check, followed by a forced checkmate with queen check, and then rook captures back, and of course after bishop takes, any capture of the bishop does the job, including promoting the pawn to a rook. A very nice finish, a beautifully played attacking game by the 15 years old Daniel Naroditsky. Let's move on and see our next example in this lesson, also from the Spice Spring Invitational, played in March of 2011. Here we are. This interesting position was played between Mark Esserman with white against the Hungarian international master Sipos. Well, let's look at the position, what's going on. Black has just played queen g7, not only protecting his knight on g6, but offering the exchange of the queens. Naturally, it's a dream for black to exchange queens, because in an endgame their extra pawn advantage would be very good. The problem is for black that white, of course, is not forced by any means to trade queens, and can and should keep the queens on the board. And white did just exactly that and played queen f5. A very good move, because it keeps the pressure on the knight, which means that the black queen cannot move away to many places because it's busy guarding that knight on g6. And I suggest you take a little bit of time and think what black should do right now, and in order to try to figure out the answer to that, I suggest you look for the threat that white may have. So assume that it's white's turn again and try to figure out what white would do next. So if you figure out the correct answer to that, you'll see that that needs to be prevented. Okay, so take a little bit of time and then come back and listen further. So in this position, black should be preventing white playing h4 and play h4 himself. But let's get back to this in just a moment. Let's first see what happened in the actual game. Black played a very natural move by attacking the white bishop on f2 by playing rook f1. And now white found the brilliant way to end the game. And white here continued with h4, a very strong move. Now, for example, if rook captures f2, actually that's what happened in the game, then simply queen g5, king h7, queen h5. Now if queen blocks, then simply rook d7 and the black queen will be lost. Or, as black played in the game, if king g8, then rook takes knight and the black queen will be lost. The game ended in a few more moves after black continued with f3, rook takes queen, king takes, check, king h8, check, and black resigned, because, for example, after the king gets out of this check, white will play king g3, and then black's f3 pawn will be lost, and then obviously black is in a completely hopeless situation. So let's go back to the beginning again and see, after queen f5, which happened in the game, and rook f1, which remember was the mistake, h4, what happens if in this position, instead of capturing the bishop on f2, black responds by capturing on h4. Well, white would simply respond by capturing back and renewing the same idea of threatening queen g5 check, followed by then capturing the pawn on h5 and winning the knight. For example, now if the game continues with f3, black trying to get counterplay, the most efficient way to play is with bishop f6, queen f7, queen g5 check, king h7 check, king g8. How beautifully the white pieces work together. And finally, when knight blocks, it's checkmate time. And let's see just one more variation. After queen f5 and rook f1, h4, which happened in the game, if black continues with g4, trying to fork himself by playing g3, then again the same problem with queen g5. And finally, let's go back to the starting position when after queen f5, black should have played h4. Now white's best option is to grab the pawn while he can for free. And now black can try an interesting trick by playing f3. Now if white captures this pawn with either the queen or the pawn, then black will simply fork and win white's rook with queen c7. Check. So therefore white must be careful. It's kind of interesting that also bishop takes pawn on c5, which is a good looking move, threatens with bishop f8 pinning the black queen right away. That would be still a big mistake. Black now has a beautiful way to actually turn things around to his favor by playing f2. Now the pawn is about to get promoted. An interesting line would be, for example, if bishop f8 anyway, the pawn would get to promote to a knight with a check, and then after king g1, a discovered check with knight g3. If king h2, then rook h1 checkmate. Otherwise, black simply grabs the white queen. Quite a nice little line. However, after f2, in this position, white can try a different attempt by capturing it, for example. But then again the check comes on c7, and it's true that the white rook is protected at the moment on b6. The problem is that after g3, which blocks the checks, pawn captures, and now white again is in trouble. Because if bishop takes, then the rook is falling, and if king g2, then amazingly the rook is falling anyway, because after bishop takes, knight h4 comes about, forking the white king and queen. Pretty nice variation. Well, of course, white can do better than that. After queen f5, h4, rook b6, and f3, at this point white can take with the queen, which is much better than capturing with the bishop, and then the position is approximately equal. Well, I hope you enjoyed these beautiful tactical attacking positions and learned some ideas, some tricks, and I really think it's important that you try to first figure out on your own what's going on. You may spend 10-15 minutes or even up to half an hour in trying to do the analysis of the situation first before you listen further and hear the correct answers to the position. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we are. In this simple looking endgame position where there are only the bishops and one pawn for white on the board, white has to be very careful because there is only one single way to win the game. Again, suggest you take your time and try to figure out the best moves for both sides and come to an objectively correct answer. Surprisingly, in this position, the most natural and simple looking c7 would be a big mistake, and that would be because the black bishop would go to d8 now. Of course, pawn take bishop is not sufficient because then white would get rid of his last and only pawn. On the other hand, promoting the pawn to a major piece like queen or rook would result stalemate. And promoting the pawn to a minor piece does not give white sufficient material advantage to win. For example, if white promotes the pawn to a knight, it almost works, but if black is careful, for example, moves the bishop to c7, then the game will be a simple draw. The reason why I said that the bishop needs to be careful, because moving, for example, to a5 would lose due to the check and then fork. But naturally, black doesn't need to fall into that trap, and bishop c7, as I said, would avoid this. So if this doesn't work, what does? Well, the solution actually is quite simple, by white playing bishop f6. The trick is that now if bishop takes, then not king takes bishop, but advancing the c-pawn ahead, and then already there is no stalemate in the picture, and therefore white wins easily. Quite beautiful. On the other hand, if after bishop f6 black plays bishop f4, trying to hold off the pawn, then bishop e5. Now if black doesn't trade, then the pawn just advances, and if it does, then black gets into a lost pawn endgame. For example, king e7, king d5, king e8, and then king e6, king d8, king d6, king c8, c7, and black is losing. A beautiful bishop endgame. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Bye-bye.